Brandon Cole thought divorcing his quiet, stay-at-home wife was the smartest move he'd ever made. He had no idea Madison Clarke was actually the hidden power behind Titan Capital, the very company paying his salary. By the time he walked out of that Chicago café, Brandon wasn't leaving a burden, he was walking away from a billionaire. And his downfall had already begun. Brandon Cole had always believed he understood people. It was, in his mind, one of the many natural talents that made him destined for success as in Chicago's fiercely competitive investment world. He could read a room, charm a board member, outmaneuver a rival, and sell a dream to a client with the ease of someone who thought the world would always bend in his direction. And perhaps for a while it did. He rode that momentum like a man convinced he was chosen for a higher tier of life, the kind where penthouse views, black card spending, and power lunches weren't luxuries but expectations. Yet for all his self-proclaimed intuition, all his curated instincts, Brandon Cole had remarkably poor judgment in the one area that mattered most, the person he had married. To him, Madison Clarke had become an accessory. He no longer wanted an outdated handbag that no longer matched the image he curated. She cooked, she cleaned, she remembered birthdays, she handled the unglamorous logistics of life. That was all he chose to see. He never wondered how she knew so much about the markets he followed, or why she occasionally offered observations sharp enough to rival those of his managing director. He dismissed her insights as lucky guesses or trivia she picked up online. In his mind, Madison fit neatly into a single category, a woman who stayed at home because she didn't have the drive or the intellect to do anything more. He had convinced himself she was a weight dragging him below the altitude he deserved. The truth, of course, was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous for Brandon. But he didn't care for nuance. What he cared about was perception. And perception was everything in his world. From the custom suits he financed on credit, to the overpriced condo sitting 30 floors above the Chicago River, to the new woman he found himself enthralled with, he cultivated an image of rapid ascent. A star on the rise, a man too important, too ambitious, to be held back by a woman who wore sweaters from department store clearance racks and drove the same car she had owned in college. He saw himself as a thoroughbred forced to trot alongside a mule. So in his mind the answer was obvious. He deserved better, deserved more. Deserved someone who matched his trajectory, someone bold, glamorous, driven by the same hunger he had. He told himself that the world was full of men like him whose marriages simply couldn't withstand success. He wasn't a villain and he was evolving. He was leveling up. And Madison, she was an era that had outlived its usefulness. When he finally made the decision, he rehearsed the speech for weeks. He imagined her crying, begging, perhaps even making a scene, but in each fantasy he stood firm, heroic in his resolve. He would be polite, civilized, even. He would offer her the house she loved, maybe even a small settlement if she agreed not to drag things out. After all, he wasn't heartless. He would treat her fairly, reasonably, generously, even if she didn't cause complications. But the truth behind his staged benevolence was simple. He wanted her gone quickly and quietly so he could get on with the life he believed he was owed. The morning he asked her to meet him at a little cafe just outside the city limits, he felt almost triumphant. It was the kind of subtle, tucked-away place that wouldn't draw eyes, an important detail because, despite his bravado, he didn't want anyone he knew seeing him and a marriage in public. Appearances mattered after all. He arrived early, checked his reflection in the window, adjusted his jacket, and reminded himself that this was necessary. This was inevitable. This was the moment he reclaimed his destiny. When Madison walked in, wearing jeans and a cardigan that he believed confirmed everything he thought about her, he barely bothered to greet her before sliding divorce papers across the table. He spoke with the tone of a man dealing with a minor inconvenience rather than a life partner of 7 years. He listed the arrangements he had deemed fair. He emphasized how generous he was being. He watched her face, waiting for the cracks, waiting to see her break so he could feel justified. But she didn't break. Not in the way he expected. The lack of reaction irritated him. It chipped at the self-image he wore like armor. In response, he doubled down. He lectured her about responsibility, maturity, and how much he had carried financially. He belittled the contributions she had made to their household. He compared her, indirectly but unmistakably, to Sierra Monroe, the woman he had already positioned as his true equal. his rightful partner. The contrast felt like a clean, ruthless argument in his head. Madison was domestic and dull, Sierra was vibrant and ambitious. Madison was comfortable in the shadow, Sierra craved the spotlight. Madison had become small. Sierra was the future. The arrogance fueled him, and he mistook his conviction for clarity. What he couldn't see, what he refused to see, was the quiet tension in Madison's eyes. Not pain, not shock, something steadier, sharper. A calculation he completely missed because he had long ago stopped looking at her with any real curiosity. He read her stillness as weakness. He interpreted her calm as defeat, and in doing so, he sealed his own fate. He signed the narrative in his mind. This was the day he freed himself from mediocrity. He walked out of that café with the swagger of a man stepping into the next chapter of his grand ascent. He left the parking lot believing he had just executed the cleanest, smartest move of his adult life. He texted Sierra before he even merged onto the expressway, telling her it was done, that he was finally untethered. Finally ready for the future they'd been flirting with. Never, not even for a second, did it cross his mind that he might have misread the situation. That the woman he cast aside wasn't dependent on him at all. That she held more power than he could fathom. That while he was busy calculating status, she was running an empire. That he hadn't just walked away from a marriage, he had walked away from the most influential woman in his industry. He thought he understood people. He thought he understood the game. But Brandon Cole didn't know he had just played himself in the most spectacular way imaginable. And as he drove away from that café, humming along to a song on the radio, already dreaming of the life ahead, he had no idea that the greatest mistake of his life had already been made the moment he slid those papers across the table. He believed he was ascending. In reality, his freefall had already begun. Brandon Cole believed that the universe rewarded confidence, and in his mind, no woman embodied the allure of upward mobility more than Sierra Monroe. From the moment she walked into the glass-lined lobby of Titan Capital Group with her designer heels, fitted navy suit, and some glittering with just enough prestige to impress the untrained eye, Brandon convinced himself she was the kind of woman he was meant to be with. She moved with rehearsed purpose, spoke with crisp assurance, and laughed at his jokes in a way that fueled the fantasy he was building piece by piece, that she saw him, truly saw him, as a man on the rise. Sierra radiated ambition the way some people radiated warmth. Hers wasn't comforting, but it was captivating, sharp, hungry, and focused on climbing fast. Brandon mistook that brand of ambition for compatibility. In reality, it was merely mutual opportunism disguised as chemistry. Before long, Sierra became the gravitational pull that made Brandon believe he had outgrown Madison. Every morning, while sipping his overpriced espresso in the Titan Capital kitchen, he watched Sierra interact with executives like she was auditioning for a job she didn't yet have but planned to take. She wasn't shy about showcasing her intelligence, even when it crossed the line into arrogance. That quality alone made Brandon feel validated. The woman he secretly desired behaved like the partner he thought he deserved. Madison never flaunted anything. Sierra flaunted everything, and in Brandon's warped logic, that made one woman valuable and the other disposable. He began engineering chances to spend time with Sierra, lingering in hallways, volunteering for unnecessary meetings, stopping by her office under the pretense of needing her opinion on a pitched deck he barely understood himself. Sierra encouraged it not because she was attracted to him, but because she recognized the unmistakable scent of someone eager to impress. People eager to impress were easy to use. Brandon's compliments fed her ego, and her attention fed his delusion. It became a transactional courtship long before he realized he was the one doing most of the paying emotionally, financially, and professionally. He told himself he was simply networking, cultivating alliances. But the truth was simpler. He was intoxicated by her. Sierra was everything Madison wasn't, and that contrast became the fuel Brandon didn't know he was addicted to. He started dressing sharper, talking louder, exaggerating his wins, minimizing his losses, all to keep up with the image he thought Sierra admired. He reshaped himself around what he wanted to be seen as a man who deserved a woman like her. A man who deserved more than what he had at home. Their relationship, if one could call it that, began with flirtation and escalated to drinks after work, late-night texts, and private jokes exchanged across the conference room table during dull portfolio reviews. Brandon believed they had chemistry. Sierra believed she had found the perfect stepping stone. His eagerness was useful to her. He could boost her visibility, back her ideas in meetings, carry rumors upward in the chain of command. He became her unofficial hype man, parroting opinions she fed him, praising her work to anyone who'd listen, defending her even when she stumbled. It never occurred to him that Sierra's mistakes were frequent, or that her knowledge of industry regulations was shaky at best. He was blinded by admiration and infatuation. He often imagined the day he'd break the news to Madison, picturing Sierra waiting for him afterward with open arms. In these fantasies she was grateful, devoted, ready to build a new life together. But Sierra had never promised him anything. She encouraged the connection because it benefited her, nothing more. She saw Brandon not as a partner but as leverage. Every compliment he gave her, every project he supported, every report he edited for her behind the scenes, all added to her upward momentum. And Brandon kept pushing her upward, believing he was ascending with her. The tipping point came during a launch event where Sierra, trying to impress upper management, pitched a marketing strategy that skirted too close to infringement laws. Madison had quietly warned Brandon months before that Titan's marketing division was at risk for cutting corners, a comment he brushed off as uninformed. He assumed his wife was parroting something she read online, ignoring that her knowledge had always been deeper than he acknowledged. The event flopped publicly. Sierra blamed interns. Brandon defended her blindly. Titan Capital absorbed a loss. And yet none of it changed his infatuation. At home, Madison's patience began wearing thin, not because she suspected an affair, but because the distance between them became wide enough to feel structural. Brandon stopped noticing when she changed her hairstyle, or when she tried new recipes, or when she asked about his day. His eyes were always elsewhere, always on someone he thought was more exciting. Every time his phone buzzed, he glanced at it too quickly. Every late shift he volunteered for was met with a flimsy explanation. Madison wasn't naive. She saw the fractures he refused to acknowledge, but she didn't expose them. She watched. Meanwhile, Sierra grew bolder. She joked openly about Brandon's marriage, hinting that he deserved someone at his level. She knew he would lap it up. She dangled her interest like bait, offering just enough affection to keep him hooked, but never enough to commit to anything real. Brandon mistook her calculated attention for genuine desire. He didn't understand that Sierra viewed relationships, alliances, and flirtation the same way she viewed investments, as asset to leverage, discard, or trade depending on the return. As Brandon drifted deeper into Sierra's orbit, his performance at work started slipping. His reports were less polished, his analysis less accurate. He spent more energy managing the image he projected to Sierra than the responsibilities of his actual job. Yet he clung to the belief that she sharpened him, that she was good for his ambition. He failed to see that she amplified his worst traits: impulsiveness, vanity, financial irresponsibility. She made him feel superior, which in turn made him blind. The tragedy wasn't just that Brandon fell for someone who didn't truly want him. It was that he built an entire fantasy future around her, a future where he was admired, respected, envied. A future where he no longer had to tolerate the life he saw as small, simple beneath him. Sierra represented escape, not love, not partnership. Escape from the version of himself he refused to confront. By the time he pushed divorce papers across a café table, Brandon wasn't leaving Madison for Sierra. He was leaving Madison for the man he imagined he could become with Sierra beside him. And that fantasy, one fueled by ego and delusion, was more intoxicating than anything Sierra herself ever offered. He didn't know yet that Sierra's ambition was built on a rotten foundation, or that the woman he believed was soaring was in fact hanging by threads. He didn't know she had lied on her R-sum. He didn't know executives whispered about her incompetence. He didn't know that Madison, the woman he dismissed as ordinary, was the only reason Sierra still had a job. Brandon Cole thought he was trading up. He was wrong. He wasn't ascending. He was being led, willingly, toward a cliff he could not yet see. Brandon Cole convinced himself he had outgrown his marriage long before he ever admitted it out loud. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow erosion, an inch here, a crack there, until one day he decided the foundation wasn't worth saving. What he never stopped to examine was that the erosion came from him, not the woman he blamed for it. In his mind, change was synonymous with progress, and progress was something he believed he embodied more than anyone he knew. He had built a narrative where he was a man destined for bigger things, someone meant to run with sharper, hungrier crowds, someone meant to be admired, envied, respected. And in that story, Madison no longer fit the frame. Her steadiness began to feel like stagnation to him. Her kindness began to feel like passivity. Her grounded lifestyle began to feel like a reminder who he used to be, the version of himself he now claimed to be shedding. He began treating the marriage like a coat he had outgrown, something that once fit, but now felt restrictive. The more success he imagined he was gaining at Titan Capital, the more intolerant he became of anything that didn't mirror the lifestyle he wanted. Madison's habit of grocery shopping with coupons irritated him. The way she refused to replace their perfectly functioning furniture annoyed him. Her contentment in wearing comfortable sweaters instead of trendy labels felt like an embarrassment he couldn't articulate without sounding cruel. To Brandon, these weren't personality traits anymore. They were evidence he was married to a woman who lacked ambition. A phrase he repeated internally with growing conviction. He didn't see her restraint as wisdom. He didn't see her simplicity as authenticity. He saw only inadequacy. Every time he compared her to Sierra, the gap widened in his mind. Sierra represented something shiny, something new, something aligned with the image he had manufactured of himself. She was the person he imagined by his side when he pictured cocktail parties in high-rise lofts, luxury vacations, and exclusive networking events. Madison, in contrast, seemed tied to the earth, budgeting their expenses, managing daily practicalities, maintaining a life that wasn't glamorous but was undeniably stable. Yet Brandon didn't want stable. He wanted impressive. He wanted to be perceived as exceptional, even if he wasn't. And Madison, unknowingly, became the canvas on which he projected all the insecurities he refused to confront. The resentment didn't show up as shouting or arguments. It showed up as subtle dismissals, eye rolls when she asked simple questions, impatience when she reminded him of responsibilities he didn't want to deal with. He stopped listening when she spoke about her day. He stopped asking her opinion about anything meaningful. He began moving through the house as if he were staying in a hotel, not living in a home. He avoided dinners with her, claiming late nights at work. He ignored her small, thoughtful gestures, the packed lunches, the straightened ties, the reminders about family birthdays as if they were obligations rather than acts of love. The distance grew and Brandon welcomed it. To him, distance meant freedom. He crafted a version of himself separate from Madison, one built on credit, fueled indulgence, and borrowed confidence. When he walked through the glass doors of Titan Capital, he felt like a different man. The office buzz, the polished chrome, the sound of heels clicking against marble floors, he absorbed it like oxygen. He told himself this was where he belonged. And because he believed Titan represented his future, he convinced himself that anything tied to his past, including his marriage, was dead weight. In conversations with coworkers, he began referring to Madison indirectly as if she were a mild inconvenience. He complained about her frugality, her lack of interest in bigger things, her so-called disinterest in his career. In reality, Madison had always cared deeply about his work, but Brandon rewrote history so he could justify what he was already planning to do. He framed himself as a man stifled by a partner who didn't understand his ambition. It made him feel noble instead of selfish. It made him feel logical instead of cruel. Late at night, while Madison slept, Brandon sat on the edge of the bed scrolling through luxury watches and downtown condos he couldn't afford, imagining Sierra by his side, imagining Madison erased from the picture entirely. He envisioned telling friends he had moved on, claiming the marriage had been drifting for years, that they had simply grown apart. He rehearsed lines that cast him as the reasonable one, the mature one, the one doing what had to be done. In these fantasies, Madison never confronted him, never challenged him, never questioned his motives. She simply faded away clean, uncomplicated, painless. He believed his separation from her was evolution rather than betrayal. Friends noticed the shift before Madison did. Brandon became louder in social settings, more boastful, more eager to talk about his career trajectory. He bragged about upcoming promotions that were far from guaranteed. He embellished stories to make himself look indispensable at work. And when asked about his marriage, he brushed it off with vague comments about different priorities. To the people who knew him well, it was obvious he was drifting away from the life he had built. To Brandon, it was obvious he was stepping into the life he deserved. He dismissed Madison's emotional labor entirely. The nights she stayed up helping him revise presentations, the mornings she packed his bag with everything he forgot, the time she comforted him after stressful days, none of it registered anymore. He had mentally moved on so completely that her kindness became invisible. He saw her only through the lens of the decision he had already made as she was outdated. She was holding him back. She wasn't part of the future he wanted to advertise. Madison sensed the distance, but Brandon interpreted her composure as proof of his assumptions. He believed she was too small-minded to fight for the marriage, too dependent on him to revolt, too ordinary to see what was happening. He didn't recognize that she had stopped asking questions, not because she lacked awareness, but because she was watching him, observing the man he had become. He misread her stillness for weakness. He saw her lack of confrontation as validation that he was right. By the time Brandon decided to file for divorce, he believed he was being rational. He believed he was choosing a path that aligned with his ambition. He believed he was removing an obstacle, rather than dismantling the best thing that ever happened to him. And with every self-serving thought, he grew more certain that leaving Madison wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary. In his mind, he wasn't abandoning his wife. He was shedding an old identity. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the identity he believed was blooming was nothing more than an inflated illusion. He didn't understand that Sierra saw him as leverage. He didn't understand that Titan Capital wasn't impressed by him. He didn't understand that Madison was far more than the woman he had reduced her to. He thought he had outgrown her. In truth, he had shrunk so far inside his own ego that he couldn't see the empire standing quietly beside him. Madison Clarke had mastered the art of being underestimated long before Brandon ever came into her life. Growing up as the quiet grandchild in the legacy-driven Clarke dynasty meant she learned early how to observe from the sidelines, how to listen more than she spoke, and how to understand people without exposing much of herself. She carried that skill into adulthood, into marriage, and most strategically into her position within Titan Capital Group, where she was the true power. Though almost no one ever knew it, the press rarely captured her face because she rarely attended corporate galas or media events. Board meetings were conducted through secure channels. Legal decisions were executed through intermediaries. She protected her privacy with the same precision she used to grow her family's empire. And Brandon, who believed he was perceptive, never once questioned how a woman he assumed had no job seemed able to move through life with such calm, calculated confidence. Madison didn't flaunt wealth. She didn't wear diamonds or couture. Her life was curated to appear modest because, contrary to what Brandon told himself, she never wanted a man to fall in love with her money. She wanted a partner who saw her, not her last name. For the first few years of their marriage, she believed Brandon was that partner. He was earnest then ambitious, yes, but in a hopeful way, not yet consumed by image. They made dinner together at their little apartment in Wicker Park, laughed about their tight budget, spent weekends at thrift stores searching for furniture they could afford. He loved her thriftiness back then. He admired her ability to stretch a dollar, to budget, to ground him when he became overexcited about career opportunities. For a time, they were a team. Madison never hid her last name from him. She simply used her mother's surname socially and kept her family's affairs separate from their marriage. Brandon never asked why she didn't use Clarke. He assumed it was a preference, never entertaining the possibility that Clarke carried weight across the American financial landscape. But wealth leaves fingerprints, even if you try to erase them. Madison's precision with numbers, her instinct for timing investments, the way she could predict market movement, the contacts who appeared in her phone but never interacted publicly with her. Brandon noticed these things, but he never connected the dots. He told himself Madison got lucky when she guessed how Titan Capital's quarterly reports would look. He explained away her insights as side effects of listening to him ramble about work. In truth, Madison had been reviewing Titan's internal analytics since her early 20s. She knew more about the company's infrastructure, risk models, and offshore holdings than Brandon's entire division combined. Yet she never corrected his assumptions. She wanted a marriage built on who she was as a woman, not the dynasty behind her. Her family allowed her that autonomy, knowing she would eventually inherit full control. By the time she turned 25, Madison became the majority shareholder of Titan Capital. She signed documents through encrypted channels, attended private board retreats under a pseudonym, and cultivated a reputation so mythic that the financial press called her the ghost of Wall Street. They meant it as praise. Madison accepted it as a shield. Whenever Brandon grew anxious about work, she was the one who offered solutions, softly guiding him toward decisions that benefited Titan, even when he didn't realize it. When he received praise from executives, it was often for ideas Madison had quietly shaped. When his department hit its targets, it was because she had subtly influenced the strategy. She used her brilliance not to elevate herself, but to support him. Believing marriage meant lifting one another. For 7 years, she held the net beneath Brandon's professional life, catching mistakes he never realized he'd made. All the while, he assumed success came from his natural talent. Then came Sierra Monroe. Madison saw the shift before Brandon did. He started wearing different collar, spending more time at work than his job required, speaking with a rehearsed swagger that didn't belong to the man she married. He became addicted to the attention Sierra gave him, attention fueled not by admiration but by self-interest. Madison recognized the pattern. She had seen opportunists before. Sierra was transparent to her, but Madison said nothing. Not because she was weak, but because she believed Brandon was at a crossroads that would reveal who he truly was. She hoped he would choose integrity. He didn't. The first real crack appeared when Madison overheard him bragging to a coworker about how he was carrying their marriage financially. The statement stung not because it was untrue. She allowed him to believe he was the breadwinner, but because he used as a justification for dismissing her as a partner. That was the moment she knew he had changed. And once a man lusts after the illusion of upward mobility more than the reality of partnership, there is little one can do. Madison began revisiting documents she rarely touched, marital assets, shared properties, accounts she never intended to separate. She saw how Brandon had maxed out credit cards to keep up with Sierra's lifestyle. She saw the impulsive purchases, the reckless spending, the borrowed confidence disguised as financial independence. She watched as he built a future on a foundation of ego and debt. And still, she waited. She wanted him to face himself without her interference. She wanted to see whether the man she married still existed beneath the vanity. But when Brandon scheduled a meeting at a cheap cafe outside Chicago without explaining why, Madison already knew what was coming. She didn't cry that morning. She didn't panic. She made coffee, tied her hair back, and put on the cardigan she knew he hated, not out of spite, but as a symbolic reminder of the woman she had allowed him to believe she was. She met him with calm, ready to let him choose his path. When he pushed the divorce papers across the table and delivered his rehearsed speech about different lifestyles and not being compatible, it confirmed what she feared. Brandon preferred the illusion of success over the substance of love. He believed she was beneath him. He believed leaving her meant moving up. He believed Sierra was a step toward greatness. After years of hiding her power, Madison saw clearly he wasn't worthy of the life she had built. He wasn't worthy of the empire she managed. He wasn't worthy of the loyalty she'd poured into him, and so she let him sign away his chance at a future he never knew he had. She let him believe he had won. She let him walk away feeling triumphant. Because the most dangerous mistake a man like Brandon could make wasn't cheating on a powerful woman, it was underestimating her. He walked out of that cafe thinking he had freed himself from a burden. In reality, he had just severed ties with the only person keeping him from professional ruin. Madison Clarke had always known that people reveal their true selves when they believe no one is watching. After years of quietly observing Brandon drift into a version of himself she barely recognized, she finally saw the last piece click into place. He believed her success was luck, her insights were guesses, and her intelligence was incidental. It astonished her how easily he dismissed every contribution she'd ever made to his career, contributions he never even realized came from her. In the early years, Madison had taken genuine joy in helping him refine presentations, reshape strategies, and understand complex trends. She never took credit for it. She wanted him to shine. She didn't need applause. But once he began viewing her as small, incapable, unambitious, something inside her shifted. It wasn't anger at first. It was disappointment, sharp enough to sting, deep enough to settle. She remembered every moment he looked past her like she was furniture, every time he waved off her insights as lucky, every instance where he interpreted her humility as ignorance. Brandon didn't simply grow distant, he rewrote the story of who she was to fit the image of who he wanted to be. That narrative allowed him to rise in Titan capital, believing he'd earned every advancement through talent alone. Madison had watched him build that inflated version of himself like a child constructing a tower of unstable blocks too tall, too fast, no foundation. She let him build it. She let him believe in it. Sometimes the only way people learn is by falling from the heights they created. When Brandon officially began prioritizing Sierra over her, Madison stopped cushioning his failures. She no longer whispered corrections during late-night rehearsals. She no longer suggested revisions that would protect him from executive scrutiny. She stepped back completely, and within weeks it became clear just how much of his success had been supported by her behind-the-scenes guidance. Reports he once presented with ease became tangled. Forecasts he once delivered confidently now rang uncertain. He misread risk models, overestimated returns, and approved projects that didn't align with Titan's conservative investment principles. The decline was slow enough that he didn't notice it at first, but Madison saw every drop. One night, she watched him practice a presentation in their living room, something she had done with him hundreds of times. But the man pacing across the rug wasn't the one she married. He wasn't hopeful or hardworking. He was performative, puffed up, mimicking the persona he thought Sierra admired. His words lacked depth. His charts lacked understanding. His ambition was hollow. She realized in that moment that Brandon wasn't operating on intelligence, he was operating on bravado. And bravado was a currency destined to collapse. Still, she said nothing. She let him hang himself with the rope he insisted on pulling. Brandon's disconnect from reality became even clearer at home. He stopped noticing the complexity of Madison's thoughts entirely. One evening, she offered a subtle but accurate critique of a market shift affecting Titan's energy division. Brandon laughed, patted her hand, and told her she had picked up a few buzzwords. The arrogance in his tone didn't surprise her anymore. What surprised her was how little it hurt. That was the moment she knew the marriage, emotionally, was already dead. A relationship cannot survive when one person refuses to see the other's mind. As Brandon continued drifting deeper into delusion, Madison quietly resumed her responsibilities at Titan, this time without disguising her resolve. She monitored Brandon's department more closely, noting the inefficiencies, the careless decisions, the risks he ignored. Though she had the power to intervene, she chose patience. She wanted the board to witness his incompetence organically. She wanted his failures to surface without her involvement. People like Brandon never learn from warnings, they only learn when consequences arrive. The Clarke family often said that true leadership meant knowing when to step back and when to strike. Madison carried that philosophy into her marriage. When Brandon began openly comparing her to Sierra, as if ambition made one woman worthy and humility made the other disposable, Madison felt something inside her go quiet, not defeated, but resolved. She realized he wasn't just drifting away, he was rejecting the future she had been preparing for them. A shared future, a grounded future. A future where stability mattered more than appearances. She wasn't angry that he admired Sierra. She was disappointed that he admired someone he didn't understand. Sierra's ambition was theatrical, a performance meant to impress onlookers. Brandon had become the easiest audience in the room. He mistook volume for intelligence, confidence for competence, and ambition for loyalty. Madison knew Sierra was playing him for influence, but she didn't intercede. She let the charade unfold. If Brandon couldn't distinguish authenticity from illusion, he had no place beside her in the empire she would eventually lead. The more Brandon drifted towards Sierra, the more Madison saw who he truly was. Not the man she married, the one with dreams and kindness and humility, but the man he had chosen to become. She mourned the version of him from the early years, the one who cooked pasta with her at midnight and dreamed of owning a small house with a yard someday. She mourned him quietly, letting the grief come in small waves. But once it passed, what remained was clarity. She began preparing for the end long before Brandon filed for divorce. She met with her attorneys privately, updated documents he didn't know existed, reorganized holdings to ensure his departure wouldn't affect Titan's stability. She made sure every thread connecting him to her empire could be cut cleanly when the time came. He had no idea that she was the architect of the very system he boasted about impressing. He had no idea he was walking through hallways she owned, pitching ideas in rooms she financed, climbing a ladder that only existed because her family built it. But the most painful realization came one evening when Brandon came home flushed with excitement, boasting about a potential promotion. "I'm finally stepping into my potential," he said, glowing. "I'm with people who understand what I'm aiming for." He didn't notice Madison pause. He didn't see the ache behind her eyes. He didn't know she'd been the one advocating for his promotion quietly for months, believing they were building something together. Hearing him credit his growth to Sierra, not knowing Madison had been his advocate, was the final severing of an emotional thread. It wasn't just betrayal, it was blindness. And nothing is more dangerous than a man who can't see the woman who stands beside him. Madison didn't strike back. She didn't argue. She simply stopped holding the net beneath him. She withdrew her influence, her subtle guidance, her protection. And like clockwork, everything she'd been shielding him from began to surface. He confused correlations, overestimated projections, misread markets, backed volatile startups, submitted reports riddled with errors. The cracks he blamed on stress were actually the absence of her invisible support. Eventually, Madison realized something even more important: Brandon hadn't outgrown her. He had outgrown the version of himself that was good, grounded, and genuine. He let ambition warp him into someone who valued spotlight over substance. He didn't choose Sierra because she was better, he chose her because she mirrored his insecurities, validated his ego, and represented the image he desperately wanted to project. Madison saw this with perfect clarity, and that clarity prepared her for what came next. Brandon Cole had always craved recognition, but somewhere along the way he forgot that recognition required substance. The more he chased the image of success, the less capable he became of recognizing when he'd crossed the line from ambition into delusion. So when Titan Capital began floating the possibility of promoting him to regional director, a position far above his skill level, Brandon interpreted it as validation of everything he believed about himself. He didn't suspect, not even for a second, that the opportunity existed only because Madison had quietly nudged the board months earlier. He assumed he'd earned it. He assumed he deserved it. And with each passing day, he grew more intoxicated by the thought of finally stepping into a role that matched the persona he had manufactured. Madison watched carefully. She understood the mechanics of Titan Capital better than anyone. She knew exactly how the board operated, which metrics they weighed most, which personalities dominated discussions, and where Brandon stood in their estimation. Before Sierra's arrival, Brandon had been promising teachable, disciplined enough, humble enough to follow advice. With the right guidance, he could have built a solid career, maybe even earned a mid-level leadership role. But the version of Brandon now orbiting Sierra Monroe wasn't the same man. His decisions were reckless. His projections were shallow. His spending habits were a liability. And yet he strutted through the office as if the promotion were already written into the bylaws. The board noticed his arrogance long before he realized it. What they didn't notice, however, was Madison's influence, because she had stopped exerting it. Without her subtle hand shaping his work behind the scenes, Brandon's flaws sharpened. But the board was split. Some saw him as a rising star. Some saw him as a gamble. Madison anticipated this. She knew the only way for him to truly reveal himself was to give him space to perform without her interference. And so, with quiet intention, she pulled every invisible string needed to ensure Brandon got exactly what he wanted: the promotion. To anyone else, it would have looked like favoritism, like a woman in power-bending systems for personal reasons. But Madison's motivations were far more complex. She wasn't promoting him to elevate him, she was promoting him to expose him. A man convinced of his own brilliance cannot hide incompetence when placed under a spotlight. Responsibility reveals character. Leadership magnifies flaws, and Brandon was not prepared for the scrutiny that came with authority. When the board finally approved the promotion, Brandon celebrated like a man who had conquered Chicago itself. He bought Sierra a designer bag he couldn't afford, upgraded his Porsche lease, and began scouting condos along the river he had no business dreaming about. He told anyone who would listen that his talent had finally been recognized. He bragged about outperforming his peers, claimed he'd been carrying the department for years, and even hinted that he was next in line for an executive track. Sierra fed his ego, praising his unstoppable climb. She encouraged him to spend, to flaunt, to live like a man at the top of his game. She wanted him overextended. A desperate man was far more useful than a comfortable one. Meanwhile, Madison observed the snowball rolling. Each purchase, each late night outing with Sierra, each careless financial decision tightened the noose he didn't realize he was stepping into. She saw the sudden spike in his credit utilization. She saw the drop in his liquidity. She saw the absurd personal loans he signed to maintain the lifestyle Sierra demanded. The more Brandon tried to act like a man of status, the faster he slid into debt. And Madison let it unfold. Her restraint wasn't vindictive, it was strategic. To correct him now would be pointless. His ego had already drowned out reason. The regional director role came with responsibilities far beyond Brandon's capabilities, but he approached the job with loud confidence. He made bold promises, the board promises he couldn't back up. His department struggled under his leadership. Team morale dropped as he micromanaged one moment and disappeared the next. He approved high-risk proposals without understanding them. He dismissed experienced analysts who questioned his decisions. He cut compliance corners because he believed procedures were optional for leaders. He began skipping mandatory audits, ignoring emails, and botching budget forecasts. The mess was growing, and he was too blinded by self-importance to notice. All the while, Madison monitored progress through the channels only she had access to. She didn't tamper. She didn't manipulate. She simply allowed the natural consequences of Brandon's hubris to play out. And for the first time in her career, she watched Titan Capital's inner circles whisper about him, not with admiration, but with concern. Some questioned how he secured the promotion in the first place. Others wondered if his relationship with Sierra had compromised his judgment. Rumors of favoritism circulated. Brandon ignored the cracks, convinced that his charisma and confidence were enough to hold everything together. But the tipping point came when a quarterly review revealed his department was operating 20 below projections. Brandon insisted the analysts were at fault. He deflected, pointing fingers, claiming he had inherited a weak team. The board didn't buy it. Numbers don't lie, patterns don't lie, leadership doesn't lie. Brandon's unraveling was visible. Through all this, Madison maintained the image of the supportive ex-spouse. She never confronted him, never warned him, never hinted that she knew the truth of everything happening behind closed doors. She didn't need to. She had placed the spotlight on him. Now the world could see him clearly. She understood something Brandon never did. Titles don't expose character, pressure does. And pressure was breaking him. He began drinking more, sleeping less, spending entire weekends trying to fix forecasts that had fallen apart, because he never understood them to begin with. He grew paranoid, convinced coworkers were sabotaging him. Even Sierra grew irritated as Brandon's unraveling threatened her own upward climb. She stopped praising him and started criticizing him, pointing out his mistakes in ways that sliced his ego open. Still, he clung to her, desperate to maintain the illusion that someone in his life believed in him. Madison was patient, not cruel. She didn't take pleasure in his downfall, she simply saw it as inevitable. A man who builds a future on delusion will eventually face reality. And the collapse, she knew, would be necessary. For the first time, Brandon would have to confront who he really was without the scaffolding she'd provided for years. The promotion he celebrated as his greatest achievement would become the very stage on which his flaws were broadcast. The higher he climbed, the harder he would fall. And Madison, who had once held him up, now simply stepped aside and let gravity do the rest. By the time Brandon Cole realized how precarious his financial situation had become, he was already buried too deep to climb out. It started subtly. Small purchases he told himself were deserved rewards, dinners with Sierra that he labeled as networking, and luxury items he believed matched the lifestyle of a newly minted regional director. But the truth was harsher. He was spending money he didn't have to maintain an image he couldn't afford. For a woman who wasn't invested in anything beyond her own upward trajectory, Sierra wanted the thrill of being associated with a rising star, not the burden of supporting a man whose shine was fading fast. Brandon, oblivious to this, kept swiping cards, convincing himself that soon, very soon, the income would catch up to the lifestyle. But the lifestyle wasn't the only problem. It was the confidence misplaced, bloated, that made Brandon believe rules didn't apply to him. He had grown so accustomed to Madison quietly compensating for his shortcomings that he assumed everything in life would self-correct. Bills would sort themselves out. Credit limits would magically expand. Debt would evaporate when the next bonus arrived. Madison had always been the ballast holding his life steady, and without her influence, Brandon floated into dangerous territory. His financial choices became reckless, impulsive, dictated by ego and the desire to impress Sierra. He took out personal loans to pay for weekend trips. He maxed out 2 credit cards on a down payment for a new Porsche lease. He bought Sierra jewelry he pretended he got a discount on. Every decision was a gamble, and the odds were against him. Madison saw all of it, every bank statement, every credit pull, every loan inquiry. She had access to the financial back-end of Titan Capital's employee benefits because the Clarke family designed the system decades earlier. She monitored his situation not out of spite but out of necessity. Titan had strict policies that prevented financially unstable executives from making decisions that might compromise the company. Her job wasn't to punish him, it was to protect the company from him. And Brandon, in his downward spiral, had unknowingly become a liability. His debt-to-income ratio was alarming, his credit score was slipping, his tax filings were chaotic. But Brandon was too wrapped up in Sierra's approval to notice any of it. Sierra noticed, though, and she didn't like what she saw. The more financially unstable Brandon became, the more irritated she grew. She began making snide remarks about his spending habits, hinting that he was trying too hard or overcompensating. She stopped complimenting his purchases. She stopped praising his taste. Instead, she positioned herself slightly out of reach, making him work harder for her attention. Brandon interpreted this distance as a challenge, not a warning. He believed he could win her back by going even bigger, nicer dinners, pricier gifts, bolder gestures. Each attempt drained him financially and emotionally. His downfall accelerated when Madison quietly allowed his financial stress to collide with Titan's compliance department. Not through sabotage, not through manipulation, but by simply stepping back and allowing the company's automated systems to operate as intended. Titan Capital's internal controls flagged executives with excessive debt. A review was triggered, unnoticed by Brandon because he ignored several emails requesting updated disclosures. The system did what it was designed to do: assess risk. Brandon was flagged as high risk. Around the same time, Sierra's patience began wearing thin. She enjoyed their early flirtation, enjoyed being admired, enjoyed using Brandon's influence to elevate herself. But the moment he became a burden, the moment he needed reassurance instead of offering it, she grew cold. She wanted a partner who lifted her, not one who dragged her down. So she pivoted, subtly distancing herself while still reaping benefits where she could. She withheld affection, withheld admiration, withheld encouragement. And Brandon, desperate for approval, kept going deeper into financial ruin, trying to regain her attention. He didn't notice the late fees piling up. He didn't notice interest rates spiking. He didn't notice that the shiny life he curated was absorbing every dollar he made, and then some. But he noticed eventually, when the first major consequence hit: the maintenance fee increase at his luxury condo. What used to be manageable suddenly tripled after Nemesis Holdings, one of Madison's shell companies, acquired the building. Brandon panicked, but Sierra brushed it off, insisting that a man of his status shouldn't worry about something so trivial. He believed her, even though his stomach churned every time he checked his bank balance. The next blow came in the form of his Porsche lease. Orion Finance, another Clarke-connected subsidiary, reevaluated high-risk contracts and increased the monthly payment. Brandon struggled to pay it. Sierra mocked him when he hesitated to schedule a weekend getaway. He tried to hide his stress, but it leaked through in small ways: night sweats, tense phone calls, rushed excuses. Sierra grew impatient. She wanted fun, wealth, excitement, not a man drowning in bills. And still, Brandon believed that with one big win at work, everything would turn around. He convinced himself that a promotion bonus was coming, that he'd secure a major client, that Titan would recognize his supposed brilliance. But the numbers didn't lie. His department was declining. His forecasts were inaccurate. His leadership was faltering. And Madison wasn't there to correct any of it. The true unraveling began when Brandon received a notice from Titan's compliance division regarding his undisclosed debts. He panicked but hid it from Sierra. He tried to fix it himself but didn't understand half the terms in the document. He avoided Madison entirely, unwilling to face the one person who would, if he helped without judgment if he hadn't betrayed her. Instead, he scrambled, took out more loans, tried renegotiating balances. Everything got worse. Sierra noticed him withdrawing, getting anxious, fumbling through meetings. She interpreted his stress as weakness, and weakness was unattractive to her. She started entertaining lunch offers from a senior executive she saw as a better prospect. Brandon sensed the shift but couldn't admit it. He still believed she loved him, or at least wanted him. The truth was harsh. Sierra wanted whoever could elevate her quickest. Brandon no longer fit that description, and Madison, she watched from afar, not with joy but with resignation. This wasn't revenge. This was the natural consequence of who Brandon had chosen to become. He was no longer the man she had once loved, once supported, once envisioned a life with. He had become a cautionary tale, a man whose hunger for validation outweighed his capacity for wisdom. Debt was only the beginning. The real collapse was still ahead. Madison Clarke didn't need to lift a finger to bring Brandon's empire crumbling down. He was doing that all on his own. But what she did need to do was protect Titan Capital from the fallout of his incompetence. For months, she had watched from a strategic vantage point as Brandon spiraled deeper into debt, deeper into arrogance, and deeper into delusion. She had seen executives raise eyebrows about his decisions. She had heard whispers about inconsistencies in his forecasts. She had read reports about his team's declining morale. And while it would have been easy for her to intervene, she refused to rescue him from consequences he had created. Instead, she focused on insulating Titan from the damage. Among the many tools the Clarke family used to safeguard their firm was a suite of internal monitoring systems, financial alarms that triggered when high-ranking employees posed potential risk to the company. As majority shareholder, Madison received summaries of these alerts in real time. Brandon's name began appearing more frequently: unpaid balances, missed disclosures, unusual financial behavior, and escalating credit utilization. The system didn't know he was her ex-husband. It only knew he was a liability, and liabilities required action. Madison reviewed each report with clinical precision. She wasn't looking for ways to punish him. She was simply ensuring Titan's reputation and assets remained untouchable. But the more she read, the more she saw the pattern forming. Brandon wasn't simply struggling, he was on the verge of a meltdown. A meltdown that could lead to fraud. A meltdown that could compromise clients. A meltdown that could stain the Clarke legacy if left unchecked. Her first step wasn't aggressive, it was administrative. She let Titan's automated escalation pipeline proceed as designed. Brandon would be notified, warned, and required to comply with updated transparency guidelines. If he ignored the alerts, as many ego-driven executives did, the system would elevate the issue to compliance auditors. And Brandon, in his arrogance, ignored every notification. He believed guidelines were meant for lower-ranked employees. He believed his new title made him untouchable. He believed Sierra's praise proved he was on the path to becoming an elite figure in the firm. What Brandon didn't understand, and what Madison knew intimately, was that Titan Capital's structure didn't care about ego. It cared about stability, and unstable employees were dealt with swiftly. Meanwhile, Sierra Monroe continued her performance, encouraging Brandon to push harder, spend more, live larger. She saw him unraveling, but she wasn't interested in catching him. She was interested in making sure she extracted every last advantage he had to offer before he completely collapsed. Brandon misread her self-interest as passion. He misread her manipulation as admiration. And Madison let him keep misreading, because it revealed exactly how far he had drifted from who he once was. Behind the scenes, Madison instructed Nemesis Holdings, one of her corporate shells, to acquire Brandon's condo building. It wasn't a personal attack, it was standard business. The property was a valuable asset, ripe for redevelopment. But she also knew the acquisition would allow Nemesis to revalue it, building fees. Brandon, already drowning in debt, wouldn't survive the increased financial pressure. Again, it wasn't addictive, it was inevitable. His lifestyle was built on a foundation of delusion, and delusions crumble under the slightest weight. Titan Capital's compliance division eventually flagged Brandon's financial instability as a direct threat to his fiduciary responsibilities. Madison received the alert at home one evening while reviewing documents in her penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply prepared. A destabilized regional director could not remain in power. The board would demand action, and she, as majority shareholder, would have to participate in the final decision. She read through the compliance report carefully. Undisclosed debts, personal loans, excessive credit usage, suspicious withdrawals, ignored warnings, and numerous discrepancies in his updated disclosure forms. The findings were severe, but they were all self-inflicted. Brandon hadn't been sabotaged. He'd sabotaged himself. At the office, executives began noticing Brandon's frantic energy. He was on edge, snapping at colleagues, rushing through tasks he once handled methodically, missing deadlines, and suffocating under the demands of the job he had convinced himself he was ready for. The promotion he had once treated as a coronation now felt like a burden he wasn't strong enough to carry. Sierra stopped defending him. She started criticizing him in meetings, not loudly, but just enough for others to hear. She was already aligning herself with a new mentor, an Asfeep who actually had the competence Brandon pretended to possess. She abandoned Brandon emotionally long before she abandoned him professionally. To her, he was no longer an asset, he was ballast. Madison saw the tipping point coming. She could predict corporate catastrophe like a weather pattern, and the storm around Brandon was gathering speed. The compliance department requested a formal review of his position. Her began compiling any complaints or performance issues. Finance rechecked his departmental budgets. Madison requested one additional audit, not to expose him, but to confirm the full scale of the risk. The findings were alarming. Brandon's department was hemorrhaging productivity. Staff turnover was climbing. Budgets were misallocated. Forecasts were inaccurate. Client feedback had dipped. And Brandon, lost in the illusion of superiority Sierra had fed him, refused to acknowledge any of it. For years, Madison had prevented situations like this. She had shielded him. She had lifted him. She had guided him. And now, absent her influence, he was revealing precisely who he was without support. Still, Madison didn't intervene. On the day Titan's leadership team convened to discuss the escalating concerns, Madison walked into the private conference room, knowing exactly how the meeting would unfold. The directors looked uneasy. The CFO laid out the financial risks. The chief compliance officer detailed Brandon's failures. Her reviewed complaints. Legal flagged potential liabilities. Every department had something to say, and none of it was in Brandon's favor. Madison listened without emotion. When they asked for her perspective, she spoke calmly, professionally, without mentioning her personal connection to him. She didn't request his termination. She didn't defend him. She simply agreed with the facts. The board moved forward with a formal disciplinary review. Brandon, oblivious, strutted through the office that afternoon, believing he was on track for an even higher promotion. He believed he was ascending. He believed he was unstoppable. Madison knew better. She knew the truth Brandon refused to face. A man propped up by ego and delusion will eventually collapse under the weight of reality. And reality was finally catching up to him. Brandon Cole had always believed he would shine brightest in a crowd. He imagined applause following him, imagined admirers whispering about his rising power, imagined himself standing shoulder to shoulder with elite executives who finally recognized his brilliance. So when Titan Capital's annual gala approached, a black tie spectacle hosted at the opulent Beverly Regent Hotel in Los Angeles, Brandon saw it not as an event, but as his coronation. It would be the perfect opportunity to flaunt his new title, parade Sierra on his arm, and cement his place among the firm's high-ranking leaders. He pictured himself gliding through the ballroom, basking in admiration, proving to the world that he had ascended far beyond the modest woman he left behind. He spent days preparing, choosing an Italian tuxedo he couldn't afford and a watch he had to rent because he pawned his own to cover one of Sierra's shopping sprees. Sierra, meanwhile, treated the gala like a runway show. She selected a shimmering gold gown, booked a hairstylist, and practiced poses in their hotel suite, imagining the photos that would circulate among executives. To her, appearances were currency, and this gala was an investment in her future. Brandon believed she was doing it for him, for them, convinced that their relationship had become a power pairing. In reality, Sierra was preparing for her next opportunity, whatever or whoever that might be. They arrived at the gala in a chauffeur-Ford car Brandon couldn't afford, stepping out onto a red carpet lined with photographers capturing Titan Capital's elite. Brandon puffed his chest, smiling wider than necessary, tugging Sierra close as if claiming her in front of the world. He shook hands too firmly, laughed too loudly, and inserted himself into conversations that weren't meant for him. He didn't notice the sidelong glances executives exchanged. He didn't see the tight smiles that faded when he turned away. He was too swept up in his fantasy to recognize that he no longer commanded respect, only suspicion. Inside the ballroom, giant crystal chandeliers cascaded golden light across marble floors, and the air buzzed with the hum of wealth, influence, and old money arrogance. Brandon felt electrified. This was his arena, he thought. This was where he belonged. If Madison could see him now, she'd finally understand what she lost. He didn't realize, of course, that the opposite was true, that Madison had known exactly who he was long before he did. He made his rounds, introducing Sierra to people who barely remembered his name. Sierra played along, giggling at his jokes, flattering executives with practiced charm. But every now and then, she'd subtly shift her attention toward higher-ranking men, letting her gaze linger just a second too long. Brandon didn't notice. He was too proudly drinking his champagne, too busy imagining the whispering admiration he assumed followed them through the room. Then the energy in the ballroom shifted. Conversations quieted. Heads turned toward the grand staircase. A hush rippled across the space with the kind of anticipation reserved for royalty. The host stepped forward, tapping a glass to draw attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please welcome the chairwoman of Titan Capital Group, the majority shareholder, and the visionary leader behind our continued expansion, Ms. Madison Clarke." Brandon froze. For a moment, he thought he misheard. But then she appeared, a silhouette framed by golden light, descending the staircase with the elegance of someone born into power rather than borrowing it. Her midnight blue gown flowed like silk water, her diamond necklace catching every glint of the chandelier. Her hair, styled in soft waves, transformed her into someone he barely recognized. Only her eyes gave her away, steady, confident, piercing through the room with an authority that silenced even the highest-ranking men. Sierra grabbed Brandon's arm, nails digging into his sleeve. "Is that?" she whispered, voice thin. Brandon's mouth went dry. He couldn't move, could barely breathe. It felt like someone had punched the air from his lungs. Madison Clarke wasn't the woman he left behind in Chicago wearing a cardigan and jeans. She wasn't the ordinary spouse he'd dismissed as unambitious. She was a titan, an empire in human form, and the entire room treated her as such. Executives stepped aside to create a path for her. The SFO bowed his head respectfully. Security followed at a discreet distance. Cameras flashed. Every eye in the room turned to her, and yet her gaze eventually found Brandon. Not with anger, not with jealousy, not with pain, but with finality. That look, calm, composed, powerful, shattered Brandon more thoroughly than any burst of rage could have. Sierra, still staring, whispered, "Why didn't you tell me your ex-wife was that Madison Clarke?" Brandon couldn't answer. He didn't have answers for himself. His mind was sprinting through 7 years of moments he had misjudged, misread, misinterpreted. Suddenly, all the anomalies made sense. At her strange knowledge of market trends, her discreet phone calls, her calmness during financial crises, her quiet confidence. She hadn't been incapable. She had been holding herself back for him. Madison stepped onto the ballroom floor, nodding to executives who hurried forward to greet her. Brandon watched in horror as Marcus Hargrove, the CFO, personally escorted her toward the stage. He felt Sierra slowly slip her hand from his arm, distancing herself from him as if he were radioactive. When Madison's speech began, the room was rapt. She spoke with precision, discussing Titan's expansion, upcoming mergers, and philanthropic initiatives with the fluency of someone who didn't just run the company, she embodied it. Applause followed each point. Admiration buzzed through the crowd. Brandon heard none of it. He was drowning in humiliation. His ex-wife, the woman he'd called unambitious, was a financial powerhouse whose name commanded global influence. And he had left her. Not only left her, he'd belittled her, replaced her with Sierra, mocked her, underestimated her. He felt the room shift again, but this time it wasn't admiration, it was judgment. People whispered behind their hands, casting glances at him, quickly connecting the dots. Everyone in the industry knew Madison rarely appeared in public. That she chose this moment meant something. Sierra backed away from Brandon entirely, positioning herself near executives who might salvage her reputation. Brandon saw her abandoning him and felt the cold truth settle over his skin like frost. He hadn't just miscalculated. He'd annihilated his life. When Madison stepped down from the stage, she approached him not hurriedly, not theatrically, but with a grace that made the moment all the more devastating. She stopped a few feet away, enough distance to draw eyes but not suspicion. "Brandon," she said softly, her voice warm but firm, "enjoy the evening." It was a dismissal, polite, professional, devastating. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, surrounded by executives who now understood exactly what had transpired. Brandon stood there with his rented tux, his rented watch, his fake confidence, and the sinking realization that he had traded the world's most powerful woman for a fantasy built on vanity. And the fantasy was collapsing around him. The morning after the gala felt like walking into a funeral procession, except the only one who didn't know he was the deceased was Brandon Cole. Titan Capital's headquarters, normally buzzing with ambition and caffeine-fueled frenzy, radiated a chilly alertness as employees whispered behind cubicle walls. Eyebrows lifted, heads tilted, conversations halted whenever Brandon walked past. The ripple effect of a last night's revelation had already spread through every department, from interns to senior executives. Everyone knew now the woman Brandon discarded was not some unremarkable homemaker. She was the Madison Clarke, the most powerful figure in the entire corporation. And Brandon, oblivious to how fast the currents had shifted, marched into the building as if nothing had changed. The first sign of trouble came when his key card flashed red at the elevator bank leading to the 47th floor, his floor. He tried again, swiping with more force, as if aggression would somehow override the system. Another red flash. A nearby receptionist, who had always giggled at his jokes, stiffened and looked away. Brandon tapped the card repeatedly, heat crawling up his neck. He imagined Sierra had accidentally demagnetized it with her purse. Technical glitch. Simple error. Nothing serious. But then the building's head of security, a man Brandon had seen escort hedge fund millionaires during VIP visits, approached with a stiff calm that made Brandon's stomach tighten. "Mr. Cole," he said, "your office has been temporarily relocated. You'll follow me." Not upgraded, not changed, relocated. The word landed sharply. Brandon swallowed, forcing a laugh. "Must be some mix-up. I'm regional director. My office is on 47. The security chief didn't blink. It's been reassigned. Please come with me." The alarm bells in Brandon's mind began ringing, but he followed, too stunned to protest. Instead of heading upward, the security chief led him downward past the polished floors, past the glass conference rooms, past the executive lounges down to the 12th floor, a level used primarily for onboarding, admin overflow, and temporary staff. They stopped outside a small room near a supply closet. The door opened with a groan. Inside sat a metal desk, 2 mismatched chairs, and a flickering fluorescent light. "This will be your office for now," the guard said. "For now," Brandon repeated, voice cracking. "What the hell does that mean? Who approved this?" Before the guard could answer, a second voice cut through the room like a scalpel. "I did." Brandon turned. Madison stood in the doorway, not in a gown this time, but in an ivory suit that screamed authority. Her presence filled the cramped office, until it felt even smaller. She stepped inside, hands clasped in front of her, posture elegant but firm. The guard retreated, closing the door behind them. Brandon tried to speak first. "Madison, Ms. Clarke," she corrected, her tone even. The reminder stung more than it should have. "Ms. Clarke," he repeated, swallowing hard. This has to be some sort of mistake. I don't understand why." "You will," she replied. "Sit." He sat. Madison placed a thick file on the metal desk. It hit with a weight that made Brandon flinch. "This," she said, tapping the folder, "is your internal audit report." "Audit? I didn't authorize an audit." "You don't have to authorize audits," Madison said. "Compliance does. And they've been trying to reach you for weeks." Brandon's pulse hammered in his ears. "I've been busy. I haven't had time to." "Your financial instability triggered an automatic investigation," she continued. "Your personal debt-to-income ratio violates Titan's risk protocols." She flipped open the file. "Loan inquiries, maxed out cards, a vehicle lease that now exceeds your monthly take-home, unpaid maintenance fees at your condo, and the missing pension payment to me." Brandon flushed. It was a banking error. Madison ignored the lie. "Your financial mismanagement isn't the only issue. Your department is underperforming by 20%. 2 analysts filed complaints about hostile leadership, and compliance found inaccuracies in your quarterly forecast that could have cost Titan millions if they hadn't been caught in time." Brandon felt himself sinking. "Madison, Ms. Clarke, she repeated. He closed his eyes briefly. Ms. Clarke, I can fix this. You've had months to fix this, she said, and you haven't. Instead, you've spent corporate funds on dinners, jewelry, and vacations under the pretense of client development. She slid a photo across the table, a screenshot of Brandon and Sierra entering a luxury resort. Compliance cross, referenced your calendar. You had no scheduled meetings that week. His chest tightened. It wasn't fraud. I didn't mean. Intention is irrelevant, she said simply. Impact is what matters. A long silence, sharp, suffocating, filled the room. Brandon's confidence, so inflated just days ago, deflated like a balloon against a blade. So what happens now? He finally asked, voice barely steady. Madison folded her hands. Today you will attend a disciplinary hearing with the board. They will determine whether your actions constitute grounds for termination. Brandon shot up from his chair. Termination? You can't be serious! I helped build this department. Madison tilted her head slightly. You mean the department I built while letting you take the credit? The words hit him like a punch. He opened his mouth, but she continued before he could form a defense. For years I guided you, she said. I strengthened your proposals, fixed your mistakes, positioned you for promotions you weren't ready for. I did it because I believed in who you used to be. Her expression hardened. But the man standing in front of me now isn't someone I recognize. And he isn't someone Titan can trust. Brandon felt desperation claw at his throat. Please, Madison. No, she said calmly, not anymore. Her voice didn't waver. Her posture didn't soften. She looked at him as if he were a stranger occupying the skin of someone she once loved. You will attend the hearing, she said. You will answer their questions. And whatever outcome the board decides, you will accept. He staggered back into the chair, the weight of her words crushing him from all sides. His mind spun. His mistakes flashed before him. Sierra's fading attention, his collapsing finances, his failed department, his deluded ego, his discarded marriage. And standing across from him was the woman he thought he'd outgrown, unshakable, composed, powerful, delivering the consequences he had earned piece by piece. Madison gathered the file, straightened her suit, and stepped toward the door. Just before leaving, she paused and looked over her shoulder. This isn't revenge, Brandon. This is accountability. Then she walked out, leaving him in the dim, flickering office alone with the truth he had spent years avoiding. Everything that was falling apart had been built on his own illusions. By the time the board voted unanimously to terminate Brandon Cole, the collapse of his carefully crafted image was already visible in every corner of his life. He had walked into the disciplinary hearing with a forced confidence, adjusting his suit jacket and telling himself he would argue his way out of it. But the moment he stepped into the glass-walled conference room, he understood, though too late, that the decision had already been made. The board didn't look at him with curiosity or sympathy. They looked at him the way surgeons look at a tumor before removal, clinical, detached, already anticipating the cleanup. He tried to defend himself. He tried to blame stress, market volatility, unreliable staff, and even Sierra's overzealous suggestions. But every excuse he offered had a counterpoint prepared by the compliance team. Every argument he constructed crumbled against the hard evidence of his mismanagement, his financial irresponsibility, and his unauthorized use of company funds. The more he tried to deny, the more pathetic he sounded even to himself. And sitting at the far end of the table, calm and resolute, was Madison Clarke, watching the proceedings with a neutrality he couldn't penetrate. She never raised her voice. She never insulted him. She never kicked him while he was down. She simply let the facts speak for themselves, facts he had created, facts he had ignored, facts he had earned. When the board asked for final comments, Madison simply said, Titan must uphold its standards, no exceptions. Her words sealed his fate. Within an hour, Brandon's access was revoked, his email shut down, his name removed from the internal directory. Security was assigned to escort him from the building. The humiliation burned through him like acid. He noticed people watching from their cubicles, pretending to work as he walked by. He passed a group of analysts whose faces he didn't recognize, yet he imagined they were whispering about him. The walk felt endless. When the elevator doors finally shut, he collapsed against the wall, fighting back a wave of nausea. Security waited silently as he gathered his personal belongings from the temporary office Madison had assigned him earlier. A framed photo of him and Sierra left behind. A stack of unopened compliance warnings ignored. a mug he'd stolen from the executive lounge pathetic. He shoved everything into a cardboard box and followed the guard out the back exit, because terminated employees weren't allowed through the lobby. Outside, the sun was too bright. He blinked against the glare, holding the box awkwardly as the security guard nodded curtly and returned inside. Brandon stood alone on the sidewalk, stunned by the speed with which his world had been erased. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been basking in the glow of the gala, imagining himself on the brink of greatness. Now he was unemployed, disgraced, and financially ruined. He tried calling Sierra, no answer. He tried texting her, nothing. By the time he reached his car, he found she had already blocked him on every platform. It was the cleanest break she had ever made. He shouldn't have been surprised Sierra had never been with him for who he was. She had been with him for who she thought he could become. Now that he held no value, she vanished. Brandon sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour, staring at the steering wheel as if it contained the answers he needed. Panic swirled inside him, tightening around his throat. Without a job, he couldn't afford the Porsche payment. Without income, his debts would devour him. Without Titan, his sum meant nothing. And worst of all, without Madison's hidden support, he had no safety net. For the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely afraid. When he finally drove home, he barely had the strength to climb the stairs to his condo. But the moment he turned the key, a notice fell at his feet, a final termination of residency from Nemesis Holdings. He had 30 days to vacate the unit. 30 days to find a new place he couldn't afford. 30 days before homelessness became a reality he had never imagined would touch him. He dropped the cardboard box in the hallway and slid down the wall. His chest tightened. His breathing turned shallow. He pressed his palms against his forehead, trying to force his mind to calm, trying to think, trying to solve a problem he had no tools left to solve. He stayed like that for what felt like forever. When he finally stood again, he stumbled to the kitchen. The refrigerator was nearly empty. The place felt smaller than usual, cramped, suffocating, stripped of the luxury it once symbolized. Everything he had built, borrowed, or forged was unraveling. No title, no partner, no wealth, no stability. No illusions left. The next morning, Brandon wandered the streets of Chicago with his sum tucked under his arm, stopping into financial firms, private equity offices, even wealth management companies he previously would be sneered at. But no one wanted him. News traveled fast in the financial world, and Titan's quiet blacklisting of him was already in motion. Some places politely declined. Others didn't bother pretending. A few didn't even accept his sum, claiming positions are full before he finished introducing himself. By the 5th rejection, the humiliation was unbearable. By the 10th, it became clear he wasn't just out of a job, he was being purged. In desperation, he even tried reaching out to former coworkers he'd ignored or dismissed over the years. Most didn't respond. One did, only to tell him they were not allowed to provide professional references due to ongoing compliance investigations. The words stung. On the 3rd day of trying, he received a devastating message from the leasing company. His Porsche was being repossessed. He spent the next morning watching a tow truck haul away the symbol of the life he thought he deserved. He didn't try to stop them. He simply watched his reflection shrink in the tinted windows until the car turned the corner and disappeared. The collapse continued. His landlord refused an extension. His credit score dropped again. His bank froze one of his accounts due to overdue loan payments. His phone was filled with automated reminders, collection threats, and overdue notices. He tried calling Madison in a moment of desperation just once. She didn't answer. Instead, her voicemail, professional and composed, played back through the speaker. He hung up before the tone. That night, sitting alone in his half-empty condo, Brandon realized something painful. He had never truly been strong. His entire life had been supported by Madison's quiet intelligence, her subtle guidance, her emotional labor, her stability. Without her, he wasn't climbing anywhere. He was falling fast and without a net, and no one was coming to save him. Brandon Cole had been unraveling for weeks. But it wasn't until he held the final eviction notice in his shaking hands that he truly understood, that everything familiar in his life was about to vanish. He had 30 days when the first notice arrived. Now he had 3. Nemesis Holdings didn't negotiate extensions, and they certainly didn't bend rules for disgraced former executives with collapsing finances. Brandon paced the condo, a space once pristine and meticulously curated for the image he projected. Now it was a shell of its former self, littered with unopened bills, empty takeout containers, and the remnants of a man who didn't yet know how to live without illusion. Everything he owned suddenly looked cheap, artificial, meaningless. The furniture he bought to impress Sierra was mass-produced junk masquerading as luxury. The artwork pieces he bragged about but never understood felt like props from a life that didn't belong to him. Even the view from the floor to ceiling windows, once his favorite way to feel superior to the world below, now made his stomach twist. Chicago's skyline wasn't a symbol of success anymore. It was a reminder of everything he had lost. He spent an entire day on the floor, sitting against a wall with his head in his hands, feeling a panic so deep it hollowed him out. Every attempt at a plan crumbled the moment he thought about it. He couldn't get a job. He couldn't afford rent. He couldn't get a loan. And he couldn't call Madison, not after everything he'd said, everything he'd done, everything he had thrown away. But as night fell on the second day, desperation overpowered pride. He packed the last box he could afford to ship, grabbed what remained of his savings, barely a few $100s, and took his suitcases down to the street. The Porsche was gone, Sierra was gone, Titan Capital was gone. Everything glamorous had been ripped away, leaving him with the brutal reality of a man who had built his life out of smoke. He checked into a cheap model near O'Hare, the kind of place where the carpets were stained and the air smelled faintly of bleach and despair. He sat on the creaking bed, staring at the flickering TV he wasn't watching, trying to figure out his next move. Each option felt like a dead end. His mind drifted unwillingly to Madison again. He hated that his thoughts always circled back to her. Hated that she was the only person who had ever believed in him without motive. Hated knowing he'd thrown away the one person who had never once viewed him as expendable. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, exhaustion pushed him into a fogged acceptance. Maybe leaving Chicago was the only path left. Maybe restarting somewhere else, somewhere far smaller and far away from the ghosts of his old life, was the only way to breathe again. The idea frightened him, terrified him, but it was better than staying in a city where every corner reminded him of the man he pretended to be. With a grim sort of resignation, he decided to return to the only place he had left, the small house he and Madison once rented in rural Wisconsin. Before promotions, before luxury, before ego. He remembered the peeling paint, the rickety porch, the fireplace that barely worked. It wasn't much, but at least it was familiar. Maybe the new owners would let him rent the guest room. Maybe he could work in a nearby factory. Maybe life didn't have to be glamorous to be survivable. He booked a bus ticket with the last of his money and headed northwest, dragging his suitcases across cracked sidewalks as the city he once claimed as his own swallowed him for the final time. The bus ride was cold and noisy, filled with worn-down travelers, people heading somewhere out of necessity rather than choice. Brandon felt like one of them now, no longer the man who strutted through skyscraper lobbies, but a man stripped down to bone. When the bus finally stopped at the edge of the rural town, Brandon stepped into a place that looked nothing like he remembered. Gone was the peeling paint. Gone was the sagging porch. In its place stood a sleek, modern structure with glass walls, solar panels, and security cameras discreetly hidden along the perimeter. The mailbox still had the old street number, but everything else had been transformed beyond recognition. Confusion gnawed at him. He double-checked the address it matched. He approached cautiously, hesitating at the walkway that had once been a cracked concrete path. Now it was smooth stone surrounded by manicured landscaping. Before he could knock, the door opened and Madison stood there. Not in a suit. Not in a gown. Just jeans, a sweater, and the same collected composure she always carried. For a moment, neither spoke. Brandon's throat tightened. Shame flooded him so violently he thought he might collapse. I didn't know where else to go, he finally whispered. Madison studied him, not with pity, not with triumph, but with a calm understanding that unnerved him more deeply than any anger could have. Come inside, she said softly. He stepped into a house that no longer belonged to the past. It was warm, modern, beautifully renovated, but still held pieces of the life they once shared. The window seat she'd loved. The kitchen island they ate pancakes at on Sundays. The living room where they first talked about future dreams. The nostalgia cut through him like a blade. Madison motioned for him to sit. He expected her to lecture him, scold him, humiliate him. But instead, she placed an envelope on the table. "This is for you," she said. Inside was $100,000 in cashier's checks. Brandon stared, unable to process it. "Why?" "Because you need a fresh start," she said. "And because what's happening to you isn't revenge. It's consequence." He looked up at her, eyes burning. "I didn't realize I didn't see who you really were." Madison shook her head. "You didn't want to see. That's different." He flinched. The truth hurt more than any insult ever could. She continued, her tone steady. "Take the money. Take the bus ticket, go to Indiana. Start over. Work an honest job. Build a life that isn't fueled by ego." He swallowed. "Why are you helping me at all?" "Because I'm done carrying you," she said. "But I'm not interested in watching you destroy yourself." The words were devastatingly kind and devastatingly final. Brandon nodded, tears he didn't expect slipping down his face. He wanted to apologize, beg, undo everything, but Madison didn't give him that opportunity. She opened the door, her expression firm but not cruel. "You have a second chance," she said. "Use it." Brandon stepped outside, holding the envelope, the bus ticket, and the weight of everything he had broken. As the door closed gently behind him, one truth anchored itself in his chest. Madison wasn't a woman he had outgrown. She was a woman he had never been worthy of. Brandon Cole boarded the bus to Indiana with nothing but a duffel bag, a folder of cashier's checks, and a sense of disorientation so profound it left him numb. The engine rumbled beneath him, and the bus hissed away from the curb, carrying him toward a future he hadn't chosen, hadn't imagined, and certainly hadn't prepared for. As Chicago's skyline shrank in the distance, it felt like a verdict being handed down. He was no longer a part of that world. He wasn't Brandon Cole, regional director of Titan Capital, strutting through glass offices with expensive suits and inflated confidence. He wasn't the man Sierra admired for his upward mobility. He wasn't even the version of himself Madison once believed in. He was simply a man with no home, no job, no status, someone forced to rebuild from the dirt up. Indiana greeted him with muted skies, wide fields, and a quiet he wasn't used to. The bus pulled into a small rural station with a flickering sign and a bench that looked decades old. Brandon stepped off, expecting to feel anger or shame or regret, but all he felt was exhaustion, deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that made him sit on the bench just to gather himself. Around him were people going about their lives as factory workers heading to shifts, teenagers laughing as they rode their bikes, an elderly couple unloading groceries from a rusted pickup. None of them cared who he used to be. None of them recognized him, and strangely that anonymity hurt less than he expected. He checked into the cheap, extended stay motel Madison had quietly reserved for him, a simple room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that sagged in the middle. A far cry from the luxury condos and hotel suites he used to inhabit. But instead of complaining, he simply accepted it. He didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. Pretending had destroyed him. The room wasn't comfortable, but it was safe, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, he took Madison's advice and headed to the industrial district on the outskirts of town. Smokestacks towered over the landscape, and the hum of machinery echoed like a heartbeat. It was the kind of place he once believed was beneath him, a world he never imagined entering, let alone depending on. But now, it represented stability, something he desperately needed. He walked into the manufacturing plant with a sum he no longer recognized. Gone were the titles inflated by ego. He removed mentions of Titan Capital entirely. He listed basic skills: punctuality, computer literacy, communication. When he handed the sum to the hiring manager, a stout man with oil-stained hands and a friendly but tired smile, Brandon braced for rejection. Instead, the man skimmed his paperwork and said, "We need hands on the assembly line. Orientation's Monday. Pays weekly. You show up on time, you'll be fine." Just like that, no prestige, no interviews with glass walls, no psychological tests or board approvals. Just an opportunity. It stunned him. He thanked the man with a sincerity he hadn't felt in years. His first day on the assembly line was a shock. The noise was relentless, the pace unforgiving, the labor physically demanding. His hands blistered within hours. His back ached. Sweat soaked through his shirt. He struggled to keep up with workers who had done this for years. But every time he faltered, someone helped him without judgment. "You'll get the rhythm," a middle-aged woman told him. "Give it time." Their kindness blindsided him. These people had no reason to care about him. They didn't gain anything by helping him. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They simply believed in doing things together, because the work didn't get done otherwise. It was a foreign concept to him, community without ulterior motives. By the end of the shift, his body felt broken, but something strange settled into his chest, a small flicker of pride. He had earned the day's pay with his own hands. No shortcuts, no illusions, no hidden safety net. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't impressive. But it was real. And for the first time in years, he felt grounded. The routine of factory life demanded a new version of Brandon. He woke at dawn, walked to the plant, and returned to the motel too tired to think about anything beyond food and sleep. Over time, his muscles strengthened, his efficiency improved. The workers began greeting him by name. They invited him to sit with them during lunch breaks, sharing simple meals and stories of their lives. He learned their struggles, their sacrifices, their triumphs, things he used to overlook because he believed they didn't matter in the world of finance. But they mattered now, more than anything in his old life ever had. Bit by bit, the arrogance drained out of him. Shame remained, but it began transforming into something healthier: accountability, humility, reflection. On quiet nights, he found himself thinking about Madison not with bitterness or longing, but with respect. She had seen potential in him when he had none. She had given him chances he didn't deserve. And in the end, she gave him the gift of a reality check so painful it knocked the false version of himself right out of his skin. He thought often about the look in her eyes when she told him he needed a fresh start. It wasn't pity. It wasn't cruelty. It was clarity, the kind he didn't possess at the time. But now, after long days on the line and long nights alone, he finally understood what she meant. He had lived his life chasing status, building facades, living through illusions. Here in Indiana, in the simplest life he'd ever known, he had nothing to hide behind. And oddly enough, that gave him room to breathe. He started budgeting carefully, something Madison had tried to teach him years ago. He cooked instead of ordering takeout. He walked to work instead of wasting money on ride shares. He mailed payments to reduce his outstanding debts. Slowly, painfully, but steadily his life began to stabilize. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Brandon wandered into a small diner near the plant. Grease perfumed the air, and the menu was handwritten, but the food tasted like home, something he hadn't felt in years. An older waitress poured him coffee and said, "Rough day, hon." He nodded. She gave him a sympathetic pat on the shoulder and said, "You reworking. That's what matters." Working. Not posturing, not performing, not pretending. Working. As he walked back to the motel under the orange glow of streetlights, he realized something profound. He wasn't running from who he used to be anymore. He was walking slowly, painfully toward who he could become. Indiana didn't give him the life he wanted. It gave him the life he needed. And for the first time in his adult existence, Brandon Cole was becoming a man his younger self would veers respected and his past self would envied. While Brandon Cole was learning to rebuild his life in the industrial corners of Indiana, far from the skyscrapers that once defined him, Madison Clarke was stepping into a world she had spent years preparing for, a world that demanded her full presence, intelligence, and vision. She had always possessed the capability, the insight, and the influence, but she had never desired the spotlight. For much of her time at Titan Capital, she preferred to operate from the shadows, letting the board handle the public while she directed the empire's future quietly. But something shifted after the events surrounding Brandon, something sharp and awakening. She realized that silence was no longer strategic. It was limiting. The world needed to know the kind of leader she truly was. The first step was accepting an invitation to the World Economic Forum in Geneva. For years, she had declined the honor, choosing instead to send representatives. But this time, she boarded the plane herself, her schedule packed with panels, private discussions, and press conferences. On the flight over, she drafted her keynote speech, refining each sentence until it reflected both her professionalism and her humanity. She wasn't just speaking as Titan's majority shareholder. She was speaking as a woman who had been underestimated all her life, and who was ready to change that for others. When she took the stage in Geneva, the audience fell into rapt attention. She didn't need theatrics or dramatics. Her presence alone commanded the room. Madison spoke with clarity about wealth inequality, the lack of support for stay-at-home parents, and the cultural blind spots that dismissed domestic labor as unimportant. She shared statistics, stories, and solutions outlining a $500 million initiative funded through Titan Capital to provide resources, education, and seed money to women who had left the workforce to support their families. Her words resonated deeply. The room erupted into applause, not the polite kind reserved for corporate speeches, but raw, genuine recognition. Headlines spread within hours. Titan Capital chairwoman launches groundbreaking fund for American homemakers. Financial leaders praised the boldness of the initiative, while social advocates celebrated the validation of undervalued labor. Madison wasn't just a corporate titan, now she was becoming a cultural catalyst. Yet for all the praise, she remained grounded. She spent her evenings responding to emails from women around the world, sharing their struggles and dreams. She bookmarked stories that moved her, made calls to local organizations to form partnerships, and revised the structure of the fund to make sure it truly helped the people it was designed for. Madison didn't want her initiative to be symbolic. She wanted it to change real lives. When she returned to the United States, she was met with a flurry of media requests. Morning shows wanted her. Business magazines wanted her. Nonprofits wanted collaborations. She accepted a select few, choosing only platforms where she could highlight the fund and the systemic issues she aimed to address. She spoke passionately about the millions of women who built households, raised children, managed budgets, and supported partners without recognition, pay, or security. She talked about her own marriage, not in detail, but with enough honesty to make a point. When society dismisses the value of domestic labor, it creates blind spots that destroy relationships, careers, and lives. People listened, people learned, and people applauded. Titan Capital's stock climbed as investors responded to the newfound visibility and social impact. Employees felt more inspired too, proud to work for a company whose leadership had substance beyond profits. Madison implemented internal policy changes that supported work-life balance, parental leave, and flexible schedules, policies she had wanted to enact for years. Now she had the authority and the conviction to push them through. Her days became filled with strategy meetings, partnerships, and long-term planning. She traveled across cities to meet grassroots organizations and visited communities that rarely saw a woman of her stature. She stepped into kitchens, community centers, and small businesses, listening to women speak about dreams they put on hold. She asked questions. She took notes. She shook hands. No press, no entourage. Just Madison doing what she did best, understanding people. In these visits, she saw pieces of her younger self reflected back at her, the version that wanted simplicity, love, and purpose. It reminded her that power, by itself, meant nothing unless she used it to elevate others, and she was determined to do exactly that. Yet, for all her success, there were moments when her thoughts drifted briefly, quietly to Brandon. Not with longing, not with bitterness, but with reflection. Their marriage had shaped her more than she liked to admit. It taught her that even the strongest love can't survive when one partner refuses to see the other clearly. It taught her that compromise becomes sacrifice when it's one-sided. But most importantly, it taught her that hiding her brilliance to make someone else comfortable was a slow form of self-erasure, and she refused to erase herself ever again. One afternoon, Titan hosted a private summit for women entrepreneurs. More than 100 attendees gathered in a modern conference center, buzzing with excitement. Madison walked onto the stage as the final speaker. She wore a navy dress, understated jewelry, and the kind of confidence that didn't demand attention, it earned it. She told them about the fund, about her goals, about the mission to recognize, validate, and empower the unseen labor that held families together. Then she paused, looking out at the crowd of hopeful faces. "You deserve to be seen," she said. "You deserve opportunity, and you deserve a life that reflects your worth, not just your sacrifices." The room erupted in applause, many women standing, tears glistening in their eyes. Madison didn't expect the emotional reaction, but she welcomed it. It meant her message was reaching the people who needed it most. After the event, she spent hours speaking individually with attendees. She shook hands, responded to questions, and knelt beside women who cried while sharing their stories. When one woman said, "I've never had anyone believe in me," Madison smiled and replied, "Then let me be the first." It was moments like these that kept her grounded, even as her influence skyrocketed. She wasn't leading from an ivory tower. She was leading from the heart, strategic, compassionate, unwavering. Through all her public appearances, philanthropic efforts, and corporate changes, one truth became increasingly clear: Madison wasn't stepping into her power for recognition. She wasn't trying to outshine anyone. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was stepping into her power because it was time. Time to lead. Time to uplift. Time to become the woman she was always meant to be. And though Brandon remained a distant chapter in her story, his role was no longer a wound, it was a catalyst. He had underestimated her. The world never would again. Months passed in Indiana, and Brandon Cole settled into the rhythm of a life that demanded honesty from him every single day. The factory shifts were long, the work repetitive, but the structure gave him something he had never truly possessed before: discipline, grounded in humility. He woke before sunrise, packed simple lunches, and walked to work through mist-covered streets that smelled of diesel, farmland, and early morning dew. Each day left him physically exhausted, but the exhaustion was clean. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was proof that he was rebuilding himself from the foundation up, without shortcuts or deception. Yet even as stability slowly returned to his life, there was a part of him that remained unfinished, a part that still needed to confront what he had lost. He didn't look for updates about Madison. He avoided financial news entirely at first, terrified he'd see her face and feel a fresh wave of humiliation. But gradually, he learned to accept that Madison Clarke existed in a different orbit now, one so far above him that even thinking of her felt like looking at the sun, blinding and painful. Still, she crossed his mind constantly, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with respect. He should be had long before his downfall. One cold December morning, he arrived at the factory break room a few minutes early. The TV mounted in the corner, always tuned to a national news network, was broadcasting live from New York City. A polished reporter stood in front of a line of glass skyscrapers, speaking excitedly about a major philanthropic award being granted that day. He wasn't paying much attention until the reporter said her name. And this year's recipient of the Global Impact Leadership Award is Titan Capital's chairwoman, Madison Clarke. The coffee cup nearly slipped from his hand. He turned toward the screen, pulse pounding as the camera cut to a live feed of Madison stepping out of a black SUV onto a red carpet lined with journalists. Flashing lights illuminated her figure in a winter white coat tailored to perfection, with her hair pulled back into a sleek bun and diamond earrings glinting in the morning sun. She looked poised, serene, and powerful in a way that struck him breathless. Brandon froze. His coworkers filtered into the room, but their chatter faded into a dull hum. His eyes stayed glued to the screen as the reporter narrated her accomplishments: the fund for stay-at-home parents, the scholarships for women returning to the workforce, the federal partnerships she helped pass, the economic initiatives she implemented that transformed entire communities. Madison wasn't just thriving, she was leading national change. When she reached the podium for her speech, the crowd quieted. Cameras zoomed in. Brandon leaned forward without realizing it. Madison spoke with confidence that radiated through every syllable. She talked about equality, about second chances, about the unseen labor that sustains families, about dignity and opportunity for all. Every word carried weight. Every sentence carried purpose. She spoke not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as someone who understood the world from all sides. She spoke with the kind of wisdom that came from experience, both painful and empowering. And Brandon felt something inside him break open. Not regret for losing her wealth, not envy for her success, but a profound, aching realization of the woman he had abandoned. This was the true Madison, brilliant, compassionate, visionary. The Madison he never bothered to understand. The Madison he belittled, ignored, and underestimated. The Madison he walked away from, believing he was outgrowing her. He had not outgrown her. He had shrunk away from her brilliance. His chest tightened as she continued her speech. To every person who has ever been told they are less than they are, to every partner who carried more than their share, to every individual rebuilding their life from the ground up, remember this: your worth is not defined by who sees it. It is defined by who you choose to become. Brandon inhaled sharply. It felt like she was speaking directly to him, though he knew she wasn't. He was a ghost in her past. But the message hit its mark, the final strike in a lesson he had been learning slowly, painfully, since losing everything. A coworker nudged him. "She's incredible, huh? Yeah, Brandon whispered. She is. After the broadcast ended, the break room returned to its usual chatter. But Brandon didn't move. He sat there long after everyone else returned to their stations, staring at the blank screen, if trying to understand how two people could begin life in the same place and end up on opposite ends of the world. For the rest of the day, he moved through the factory floor in a haze. He worked his shift, tightened bolts, checked meters, and followed procedures, but his mind drifted endlessly back to Madison's voice, her grace, her power, her kindness, her clarity. He finally understood something he had never grasped before. Madison didn't become this woman because of her wealth. She became this woman because she never abandoned her integrity. He had spent years trying to climb socially. She spent years lifting others. He had pretended to be more than he was. She had quietly been more than anyone realized. He had chased validation. She had pursued purpose. And in the end, her rise didn't diminish him. It revealed him. That night, Brandon returned to his motel room feeling more grounded than ever. He wasn't angry. He wasn't ashamed. He was humbled deeply and authentically. He sat at the tiny table with a notebook and pen, tools he hadn't touched since leaving Chicago, and wrote something he had never written before, a letter to Madison. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for another chance. He didn't ask for contact. He simply thanked her for the years she supported him, for the final push toward accountability, and for the money that helped him rebuild. He told her he was working honestly now, earning his days with sweat instead of pride. He told her he hoped she continued to grow, inspire, and lead. He told her she deserved every ounce of recognition she received. He ended the letter with a single line. You helped me become the man I should have been all along. He folded the letter gently, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it to the Titan Capital Corporate office. Whether she opened it, read it, or threw it away wasn't his concern. Writing it gave him closure. When he walked to the mailbox and dropped the envelope inside, he felt something shift, a weight lifting from his shoulders. Not because Madison forgave him, but because he had finally forgiven himself enough to move forward. Brandon didn't want his old life back. He wanted a better life, a real life. And for the first time in years, he believed he might actually build it. The lesson behind this story lives in the quiet spaces between rise and fall, in the slow shifts of character that decide the fate of every relationship. If Brandon's downfall teaches anything, it is that arrogance blinds more thoroughly than darkness. He believed success came from performance rather than substance, from appearances rather than effort, from ego rather than accountability. And because he saw the world through the lens of ambition without ethics, he failed to see the most important truth: real power isn't built through the image you display, but through the integrity you practice when no one is watching. Madison had been the foundation beneath him for years, steady, intelligent, perceptive, yet Brandon mistook her steadiness for weakness, her kindness for complacency, and her humility for a lack of value. The story reminds us that when you never pause long enough to appreciate the people who help you grow, you eventually lose them, and in losing them, you lose the version of yourself they helped you become. Another profound lesson woven through their journey is the danger of mistaking noise for worth. In his hunger to impress others, Brandon chased validation the way a drowning man chases air. But validation is temporary fuel. It burns fast, it burns bright, and then it burns out. Sierra praised him not because she believed in his potential, but because she saw him as a stepping stone. She mirrored his ego, not his soul, and in choosing her, he didn't just betray Madison, he betrayed his better instincts. The story illustrates that when you choose people who excite your insecurity, instead of people who strengthen your character, you build a life based on sand, not stone. And sand always collapses. Sierra's abandonment wasn't a tragedy, it was a revelation. She didn't change. She simply stopped pretending. Brandon didn't lose a soulmate. He lost a mirror that reflected the worst in him. Madison's arc reveals a different lesson, the quiet strength of self-worth. For years, she held her brilliance close, not out of fear but out of intention. She didn't need attention to validate her identity. She didn't need applause to feel whole. But when she was pushed to reclaim her voice, not for revenge, but for justice, she stepped into her power with grace rather than rage. She didn't destroy Brandon. She simply stopped carrying him. And when she stepped back, he collapsed under the weight of his own choices. There is a lesson in that restraint. Maturity is not measured by how loudly you retaliate, but by how calmly you remove yourself from someone who refuses to grow. Madison showed that power used wisely does not crush, it corrects, it restores balance. It creates space for healing, even if the healing looks like loss at first. A deeper message emerges when Brandon begins rebuilding his life. Hitting rock bottom forced him to confront himself without filters, without distractions, without excuses. Working in a factory, living in a simple motel, and reconnecting with humility gave him something he had never earned before, an authentic sense of responsibility. His transformation teaches us that redemption isn't a gift someone hands you. It is a lifelong effort, built little by little through honesty, discomfort, and discipline. When Brandon saw Madison's success on the news, he didn't spiral into resentment. He didn't curse her name. He didn't try to pull her down. Instead, he recognized the depth of her character and the truth of his past shortcomings. That moment is another lesson. Accountability is not about drowning in guilt, but about acknowledging the truth so you can become better than your past self. The final lesson rising from this story is the difference between losing someone valuable and learning from the loss. Many people fall apart after a breakup, but Brandon's collapse wasn't caused by Madison leaving, it was caused by his refusal to value her when she stayed. She represented love, stability, partnership, and quiet brilliance. He traded all of it for glitter and attention. Only later did he understand that not every person in your life is replaceable, and the ones who build you up are the ones you should protect. His gratitude-filled letter shows growth, not desperation. It symbolizes the maturity that comes from finally seeing the truth. Madison wasn't the one who failed the marriage. He was. And while he could never return to her side romantically, he could honor her through the man he was becoming. Ultimately, the story teaches that life will always reveal who people truly are. Some rise when their power is tested, others crumble when their pride is exposed. Some lead with compassion while others lead with ego. Madison rose because her strength was real. Brandon fell because his confidence was a performance. But even in falling, he learned something priceless, that the path to becoming a better man begins the moment you stop blaming the world and start rebuilding yourself with honesty. Madison didn't need him to break for her to thrive. She thrived because she never stopped growing. And Brandon didn't need her to save him to begin healing. He healed because he finally chose growth over illusion. The story's final message is simple but profound. You cannot rise higher by standing on someone else. And you cannot fall lower than the moment you refuse to acknowledge your own mistakes. Growth demands honesty, love demands humility, and success demands substance, not showmanship. Madison and Brandon walked different paths in the end, but both learned the same truth: our choices shape our destiny, and the people we honor along the way often determine whether we rise with grace or fall with noise. If you find this video helpful, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss upcoming videos. If you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd really love to hear your feedback. Thank you for watching until the end.